Welcome everyone to today's webinar on military chaplaincy in World War II. My name is Michael Skeggs. I'm Director of Programs at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, and I'll just say a few words on behalf of the lab before we get started. I'll also note that we are having some difficulty, so to speak, in the lab studio. So I will be off camera today, but here I'll just be the disembodied voice. First, like most of our events, this session is being recorded, and so if you need to leave early, or you missed something that you want to come back to, you'll get a link to that recording as soon as it's available. We post it on the YouTube channel and the website, and so you can always go back and watch again. When we send out that link, you'll also have a chance to fill out a very brief survey on your experience. I'd really appreciate if you could take a few moments to fill that out. That helps us plan future events and respond to your needs, and we can do events that you want to have. So with that, let me introduce today's guests. G. Kurt Piehler is a specialist in U.S. history with an emphasis on the 20th century, with a bachelor's degree from Drew University and PhD from Rutgers. He is the author of several books and many articles on military history, and was the founding director of the Rutgers Oral History Archives of World War II, where he conducted over 200 interviews with veterans of this conflict. His new book, which we're discussing today, breaks new ground by recounting the armed forces' unprecedented efforts to meet the spiritual needs of the 15 million men and women who served in World War II. GIs flocked to services, and when they mourned comrades lost in battle, it was chaplains who offered solace and underscored the righteousness of their cause. Drawing on an extensive range of letters, diaries, oral histories, and memoirs, Piehler challenges the conventional wisdom that portrays the American GI as a non-ideological warrior. American GIs echoed the views of FDR, who saw a Nazi victory as a threat to religious freedom and recognized the anti-Semitic character of the regime. Official policies promoted a civil religion that stressed equality between Protestant, Roman Catholicism, and Judaism. Many chaplains embraced this tri-faith vision and strived to meet the spiritual needs of all service people, regardless of their own denomination. While examples of bigotry, sectarianism, and intolerance did remain, the armed forces fostered the free exercise of religion and promoted a healthy respect for the plurality of American religious life among GIs. It's a great summary of the book. Professor, I turn it to you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I really want to thank you for this invitation, and I'm particularly pleased to talk to chaplains and also to scholars who study the chaplaincy, not only in the military context but in other ways. My daughter once teased me at one point. She was really angry because I couldn't do something, and she said, "You've been working on this book my entire life," which was, she was born in 2008. I basically started the books serious, in a serious way in 2009, and I finally finished it in 2012. In 222, it was published in 221, and I've learned a lot about religion. And I remember talking to an editor, and she said, "Remember, you're a military historian. Make sure you talk to military historians." And I sort of had three audiences in mind for this book, and I did take to heart what this editor advised, like make sure you talk to military historians. So one of the things I really look at and contribute in this book is to a debate and sort of a scholarship that looks at the social history of the American GI. What motivated him to join, what motivated him to fight, what sustained him. And one of the debates historians have, or one of the arguments made, I think most famously by Stephen Ambrose in Band of Brothers, is that comradeship is key, that the GIs fight not to let their fellow GI down, particularly in battle. And I don't necessarily disagree with comradeship, but I think religion, particularly prayer, is even more important. That when GIs were asked by social scientists during the war itself what was most important to sustaining them in battle, it was prayer. But I did, in my book, wanted to speak to religious scholars, and one of the things my book argues is that religion for GIs is really important in a number of ways. One, it's a real marker of identity. I mean, GIs, the whole term GI, GIs really are stripped of their identity. Government issue. That's, government issues, uniforms, it issues weapons, it also issues men. And there's a real effort to eliminate individual identity in a lot of ways. I mean, the dog tag partly reflects that. The Marine Corps in particular wants to strip away individual identity and make people into Marines. Religion was one of the few areas where you can, in fact, preserve identity. You could stamp on your dog tag P, C, or H to reflect religious identity. You could attend services. You had a right to attend services. You had a right to adhere to your religious values. Identity is really, I think, interesting. For example, you'll see secular Jews who attend services not so much out of a desire to express religiosity, but a desire to express ethnic solidarity. One of the other themes I think, or one of the things I wanted to get at, and some of this sort of ended up on the cutting room floor. I had to reduce my manuscript from 170,000 words to 130,000, is religious discourse. We know from statistics that a lot of GIs, for example, attend religious services. We know from their diaries and letters they're attending religious services or seeing the chaplain to deal with problems. But their religious discourse is pretty secular. I remember reading one diary of an officer, an artillery officer. He had very little to say. He often writes about going to mass, but says very little about religion itself and what's happening at mass or religious ideas. He says a lot more about the movies he attends and his views towards the movies he attends. And I think this is a shift from, say, if you read Civil War diaries, we can, I think, often overestimate the religiosity of many Civil War soldiers. This is after a war that gives us the name hooker for prostitutes. But nonetheless, there are a lot of Civil War diaries and letters where there's a very overt expression of religiosity. I think of the Puritans, both in War and Peace, and how they fill pages and pages of spiritual reflection. You just don't have that level of discourse in a lot of GI letters and diaries. Military historians, I often tell my students who study military history, graduate students, I said, our conferences are really interesting because you get a lot of active duty service people attending the meetings. The military puts a lot of resources, particularly the Army, into the study of military history. So we're used to talking to a larger audience than just scholars and students. And as I said, I couldn't be more pleased to talk to actual chaplains who are actively serving as chaplains, both in the military and other ways. I think there are lessons, there are issues that come up in World War II that are relevant today to chaplains. So, and I also want to say, in doing this book, I realized how untapped chaplains' records are by military historians in general, that I think one should look at chaplains' records, not simply if you're writing about religious history, but if you're writing about military history in general, because I think chaplains, particularly in World War II, which I've come to know best, they're remarkable. They have a really liminal place within the military. They are very much part of the military. And I think of, for example, Chaplain Eichhorn, who is this chaplain who gives a service shortly after the liberation of Dachau to those who are liberated at Dachau. And he starts off his address by saying, I address you as an American soldier, and talks about his role as a soldier, but then says, I address you now as a rabbi. And I think many chaplains embrace that duality, that they are soldiers or they are sailors, so to speak, but they're also chaplains. They're also rabbis or priests or ministers. So chaplains in World War II, they're under the chain of command. They're officers. They receive officer pay, but they're also spiritual. The Army in particular insists that they are to adhere to the tenets of their faith. Chaplains, I think, are unique in the military in World War II in that they're the only ones that GI can go to and have, and what they say to a chaplain can be held in strictest confidence. Even physicians have to divulge what a GI says to them, say in a court martial. Chaplains have their relationship to a GI is sacrosanct. I think good chaplains, above all, adhere to the notion, while they're part of the military, they're also not part of the military, that they have a duty and must remain faithful to their faith. One of my central arguments in my book that I think very much relates to the chaplaincy is what happens in World War II. I think one of the things I was sort of stunned by was how little resources the federal government put into the chaplaincy, put into religion into World War II. For example, I mean, it was one of the statistics that stunned me was, for example, the Confederacy. Half of all units went into battle in 1861 without chaplains. Many units of the Union Army did not have chaplains. The chaplaincy, there is no chief of chaplains until the reforms of the National Defense Act of 1920, where both the Army and Navy get chief of chaplains. It's not until the early 1900s do you have this effort to professionalize the chaplaincy, but the chaplaincy is really small, even in World War II, compared to what it becomes in World War II. There is a real effort, particularly in part of the Army, to ideally have one chaplain for every 1,200 men and women in uniform. But it is not simply the chaplaincy where the government puts unprecedented resources. For the first time, and this is partly the doing and the adept lobbying of Chief of Chaplains William Arnold, a Catholic Monsignor, but the Army gets money to build chaplains in Army bases. You have a systematic effort to provide bases with chapels for the first time. The government prints at government expense for soldiers sacred scriptures for Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Why does the government do this? And I think part of this reflects the Rooseveltian vision. I think Franklin Roosevelt, the Army particularly, is the willing servant. And Roosevelt really believes religion is an important value to sustain a liberal democratic society. It's probably one of the few things consistent in Roosevelt's worldview. He's a remarkably pragmatic individual, but religion is important to him personally, and it's important to him he thinks for defining American society. And what I'm also really was really struck by was Roosevelt's devotion and embrace of religion pluralism. He thought that America is strengthened by religious pluralism. When asked to give an address nationwide on behalf of the National Council of Christians and Jews, I mean, he very forthrightly says, we come from many faiths, but we are strengthened by that religious pluralism. I was also struck by his strong promotion of and denunciation of anti-Semitism. You have in World War II an unprecedented number of Catholic priests and rabbis serving in uniform. Something like half of all Reform rabbis are in uniform during the war. The Army, which is the willing servant, I mean, I think it's very eager to translate this Rooseveltian vision into policy, but I also it reflects the Army's view that it needs to cater to the needs of the citizen soldier. And one of the ways to cater to that is to provide for chaplains and to promote the free exercise of religion. But the Army also sees the chaplaincy as a way to promote morale, to sustain GIs in combat, but also use moral suasion as a way, ideally, to keep men out of brothels, gin joints, and gambling debts. Now, one should also say the Army is very pragmatic. So, for example, every Army chaplain is required to give a moral lecture, not a sermon, but a moral lecture every month. But also the Army freely distributes condoms and creates prophylactic stations. So it really wants to have it both ways. One of the things I get at in my book is the differences between the Army and the Navy in terms of the chaplaincy, in terms of religion. So the Army, for example, makes the chief of chaplain, William Arnold, into by the end of the war, he's a major general. He's autonomous. The chief of chaplains reports directly to the chief of staff. Now, chaplains in the Army, they're reminded they do not take orders from the chief of chaplains. They take orders, they're staff officers, they take officers from their commander. But Arnold is in a position to really intercede on behalf of chaplains. And one of the ways that you see the Army really giving chaplains a lot of autonomy is chaplains often have sacred space that they control on military bases. They, in fact, have chapels. They also cannot be assigned ancillary duties. They are reminded that they can only, their principal role and their only role is to promote religiosity. Now they are to counsel men, and they're to serve all GIs. And chaplains, I think, of all faiths freely embrace the notion that they will counsel any GI irrespective of faith. And that role as a counselor is a central one to the chaplaincy, but also one that the military very much the Army very much wants them to perform. The Army, in contrast to the Navy, the Navy, I remember a naval officer saying, she began to question this after Tailhook, but she said, early in my naval career, I bought the Navy line: what is good for the Navy is good for the country. And the Navy bristles at taking orders from their command, even from their commander-in-chief. And Roosevelt had 4 sons in the military. Two were in the Air Force, one was in the Marines, and one was in the Navy. And he wrote to his son who was in the Marines, and he said, "Oh, if you were in the Army, they would have promoted you a long time ago, because they know I'm their commander-in-chief. The Navy doesn't quite think that at times. And so that's why they've been slow in promoting you." The Navy does not give the chief of chaplains in World War II autonomy. Ultimate control of the chaplaincy, particularly of the appointment of chaplains, still rests with the chief of naval operations. The chief of chaplains is very much subservient to the chief of naval operations. While there are chapels on Navy bases, in terms of ships, there is no designated sacred space, and chaplains are very much dependent upon a Navy captain, a vessel commander, giving them permission to hold services. And there are commanding officers who really want nothing to do with religion and religious life. So if you look at ships design, there are no chapels on a Navy ship. They're in World War II very much a jerry-rigged affair. The other thing about the appointment of chaplains, the chaplains and the assignment of chaplains, the Navy just does not put enough chaplains on ships. At one point, it even reaches the presidential level. The military bishop writes for the Catholic Church, writes Roosevelt and says there are just not enough chaplains on board ships, particularly Catholic priests. Roosevelt looks into it, and sure enough, they're not enough. He even says they should be putting more chaplains on ships. I mean, I think for Catholics in particular, this is really important because of the role of the sacraments in terms of the religious life of a devout Catholic. I think they are particularly sensitive, the church and the church hierarchy. But I would also add the chief of chaplains for the Army is really sensitive to the issue, the importance of having Catholic priests available to chaplains. The other thing that I found incredibly stark, and it very much reflects, I think, the differences between the Army as the willing servant and the Navy. The Army thinks it's important that African American troops have access to Black chaplains, to Black ministers, and so they actively recruit Black chaplains, and they appoint several hundred are ultimately commissioned. Not enough. And there's a lot of institutional racism present within the Army, even in the hierarchy of the chaplaincy office. But still, compared to the Navy, the Army is remarkable. And another thing about race that I think will reflect the standing of African American ministers and chaplains and the Black church is they are sort of the fourth church. You have the tri-faith. Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, but then you have the Black church, and this is reflected in that the Jewish Welfare Board, the Catholic hierarchy, and the national the mainline Protestants all are allowed to send a mission abroad, at government expense. So Cardinal Spellman goes abroad to visit Catholic troops. A key Protestant, a mainline Protestant leader is sent abroad. One of the leaders of the Jewish Welfare Board goes abroad to meet to visit Jewish GIs, and a black bishop is sent abroad to visit GIs, black soldiers serving abroad. He goes on a world tour. Evangelicals don't get that. They write, they want to do that. They do not get that, and that's one of the sources of tension. In sharp contrast, the Navy will only appoint 2 black chaplains during the war, and it much less sensitive to the religious needs of black sailors than the Army. So one of the things that I one of my majors in college was religion, and I particularly enjoyed reading a lot of 20th century theologians, particularly Reinhold Niebuhr, the Niebuhr brothers. I very much in this book, and I didn't cite it in the bibliography, but I very much thought of Richard Niebuhr's classic work about Christ and culture. I still think it's probably one of the most influential books I've read in my life. I had some really excellent religious professors. My worldview on religion was very much influenced by a Professor William Stroker. And his courses on particularly the Hebrew Bible. And I also was a research assistant for him when he was working on a book on the non-canonical sayings of Jesus. So theology is something I'm interested in, and I made no pretensions to trying to I was very modest in my theological contribution, but I very much thought about the issue of establishment of religion. I think some of the arguments against establishment of religion is in terms of the impact on religious minorities, and being a religious minority. I'm very sensitive to that issue. On the other hand, I also think there's issues involved when you establish religion, what it even means for majority religions, and what happens when the government establishes with religion. So, for example, Roman Catholics, priests, and the hierarchy bristled at the sort of, while they recognize the need to serve all, and in fact, a lot of priests really enjoy, for example, one priest says, it's been remarkable interacting with the particularly southern boys who know nothing about Roman Catholicism. I had this one illiterate lad who asked me, why aren't priests married? He thought we could marry. But also, he saying, I'm out in the field and I lead mass, and all these Protestant GIs watch me, and they realize that Catholicism is it becomes less alien to them. They see me, performing last rites, and they have a better understanding of Catholicism. There were Catholic priests who even skirt sort of Vatican laws at the time, basically church law at the time. One rabbi writes about this one chaplain, Anzio, who just welcomed the chance to lead Jewish services if he had the opportunity. I remember this one account of a GI who said, he attended services, and he was stunned at this Presbyterian minister who led Yom Kippur services. He said in perfect Hebrew, just couldn't believe it. There were Jewish rabbis, particularly Reform rabbis, who embraced the idea that they would lead general Protestant services. But I think there are real issues when you establish a religion, and I think there's a reason to establish religion even if to promote the free exercise of religion in the military. You really do need, I think, a government-supported chaplaincy, and you need government support for religion. The military is different from. I think the only other institutions that are similar are institutions like prisoners, where there's a limited freedom you have. If you're a GI on a ship, you cannot go to the local church in your community. So there's I think a reason to establish a religion, but one has to be careful when you establish a religion. And it's interesting to see the tension, like where Catholic priests feel, they feel impinged upon when they were asked to participate in interfaith services. They reject interfaith services. They think the only way to salvation for their Catholic boys is by attending mass, and they warn their men, do not attend Protestant services, do not embrace interfaith services, even at Christmas time. There is, chaplains feel put upon, particularly Navy chaplains, put upon when they're ordered, for example, to run the finances of an officer mess and have to buy liquor. This really irritates Methodists, which has a Methodist ministry, and there's a strong dry tradition within the Methodist Church. It often irritates evangelical ministers who resent having to say, buy liquor. And the Navy, which requires, in fact, chaplains to take ancillary duties, say, run the CHIPS library, serve on court martials, serve as recreational officers. A lot of them really bristle when they have to purchase liquor. One of the clear areas where the government is establishing religion and dictating to face on how religion will be structured is the question of women ministers. There are, in fact, Protestant denominations in World War II that ordain ministers. And in fact, one of these ministers, she is the chaplain to the one of the branches of the Illinois legislature. I think she's the chaplain for the House. And she writes to the chief of chaplains and says, I want to be a chaplain and I want to serve the women, service people. I want to serve the WACs, and it's rejected out of hand. Both the Army and the Navy declare that only men can be chaplains, and this, I think, is very much government establishment of religion and impinging on the free exercise of religion. That women chaplains should have been commissioned in World War II, especially when the fact that all branches create women's auxiliaries in the war. I finally want to say, since I'm particularly, as I said, I'm delighted to be talking to chaplains. My enormous respect for a lot of the chaplains I encountered in writing the book of all faiths. I just was in awe of some of these individuals for both their moral and spiritual courage. So I just, for example, Chaplain Samson, who jumped at D-Day with his troops, who was twice taken as prisoner of war. And I loved one story about, sort of sectarianism and sometimes how ridiculous he was. He says, when he was taken prisoner at Normandy, he decided to lead the men in the Lord's Prayer, since he knew both Protestants and Catholics knew it. And he said he almost went into hysterics because of the tension. He almost broke out into hysterical laughter when the Protestant and Catholics started debating what was the correct form of the Lord's Prayer. And he basically said to both groups, this is ridiculous. Say it the way you've learned it. It's not a big deal. This is not cutting edge, this is not the big difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. But Samson, when I say he showed moral courage, he escaped at Normandy, rejoined his airborne unit. But then during the Battle of the Bulge was taken prisoner, takes part in a horrendous march to eventually a railhead where he's transported to a prison camp. At his prison camp, he, along with the Swiss representative from the Red Cross, he, along with the senior man of confidence, protests the segregation of Jews in his prison camp. And he was very much aware of the need to serve Jewish GIs and to protect them during the war. I think of, for example, Chaplain Eichhorn, who is, at one point during the war, he's ordered by his commander to hold services in this one town. And he basically gets there and it's on the front line. It's not fully secure. And he holds services there, Yom Kippur services, Kol Nidre services, and then the next day. And as he's leaving, one of the intelligent people said to him, "We're not quite sure that this synagogue was out of range. But the fact that we knew it was out of German artillery range because they would have shelled it if they saw 200 people gathering there for services. And Eichhorn was not so pleased to learn this. But Eichhorn made it a point to sort of stay on the front lines and stay close to men. He often looked down upon chaplains with their shiny boots because he had muddy boots. He also had a run-in with Pat's MPs because he decided to drive himself. His chaplain's assistant wasn't a very good driver. He drove himself, but he got into trouble. This was against military law. He was picked up by Patton's office, by Patton's men, taken to Patton's headquarters, and his general interceded for him. He said to Patton, "I know you don't want a Jewish chaplain, but don't harass my Jewish chaplains when they're getting in your way." But I've often been struck by the sort of Eichhorn's sort of sermon he gives at the liberation of Dachau, and what he has to say to those who've been, persecuted by the Germans, both Gentile and Jewish, and what to say to men who would endure and women who would endure horrendous barbarity. It's really, to me, one of the remarkable moving sermons of the war. And I would also say I've often been struck by Israel Yost, who is a Lutheran pastor, who is very Lutheran. I'm very familiar with the Lutheran Church and Lutheran ethos, having grown up as a Lutheran. And even though I've left the church, I have a real, there's a lot I like about Lutheran, particularly Lutheran pastors. And Lutheran pastors take their theology really seriously. And so he basically said, "I will not lead Buddhist services. I will not. That's just not right." And he very much wanted to. He very much evangelized among those he served. He very much wanted to convert them to Christ. But on the other hand, he respected religious pluralism. He made his tent available to Buddhists to hold services, distributed Buddhist literature. There's a great picture of him. I wasn't able to use it for my book because access to images became difficult during COVID. But there's a great picture of him in his published memoirs of him using the non-denominational marker for Buddhists. He definitely respected religious pluralism, respected the fact that half the men in his unit were in fact Buddhists, and he was beloved by his men, both Christian and Buddhist. And I, as I said, Samson, Yost, Eichhorn were really remarkable chaplains, and those those I could embrace. I'm struck by how many are attending, and I don't know if this would be a good point to take some questions. I have lots to talk about, so if there are not a lot of questions, I have much to say about, for example, the USO. Particularly the religiosity of African Americans, the religiosity of women, the religiosity of Japanese Americans, the role of, for example, GIs as liberators, and their response, particularly to discovering the concentration camps, and their role early in the occupation. So I covered a lot of ground in my book, but I learned once in my talk, make them want more so they'll actually, potentially buy the book and read it.
There are a couple of questions. Let's pause for a moment and think about these. So Glenn asked a really interesting question, and I was wondering about this to an extent as well. Today, of course, the religious diversity within the armed services is, I would imagine, much greater than it was during World War II, at least in how folks identify. And this idea of who approves a chaplain for service, who endorses the chaplain, is so important. So Glenn says, what does your research reveal about how certain denominations endorse chaplains? So he's talking about Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists. These are not quote unquote mainstream denominations or traditions. Where do they fit into all this?
Oh, as I said, this I could talk at length, and this is among the stuff that ends up in the cutting room floor. And I want to really give a great shout out to the Mary Baker Eddy Library for giving me a grant. And I really spent a lot of time, particularly with the Christian Scientists. I spent 2 weeks at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. This is where I thought the Army was really stupendous in World War II. The Army, for example, while you could, I think Ronette Stahl argues in her book on the chaplaincy in the 20th century, say their efforts were half-hearted, they did look for a Buddhist chaplain to serve Japanese American troops, and they did find Japanese American Protestant ministers to serve Japanese American troops. And one of the things I think the Army and the Navy does, but particularly the Army, they want the chaplaincy to serve in proportion. If 30% of the of troops are Catholic, they want 30% of Roman Catholics, 30% of the chaplaincy to be Roman Catholic, and this policy meant they are actively trying to recruit in a way they had never done before, priests and rabbis to serve in uniform. They also turn away chaplains if they're not enough of a particular denomination. Where the Army, I think, is really very good in contrast to the Navy. I mean, the Navy says to the, I was just shocked by how blunt he writes to the leaders of the Christian Science, the Church of Christ scientists. He writes, when you guys start ordaining ministers, I'll appoint more than one as a chaplain. And the Army never says something like this. The Army goes to great lengths to commission chaplains for particularly Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and for Christian Scientists. And the way they do this is, one of the things they require both chaplains who don't have from churches that don't have an ordained clergy, is they have to take a test, a test on theology, their knowledge of theology. They also have to sort of have comparable experience. And so what for Christian Scientists, it's Christian Science practitioners who are commissioned as chaplains. And Christian Science practitioners help Christian Scientists in terms of healing, and there's sort of the closest you have toward our ordained clergy within the church. Now, when I get to the issue of gender, the bulk of Christian Science practitioners are women. They cannot be commissioned. So it's the minority who are in fact men. Until the 20th century, you did not need ecclesiastical endorsement to become a chaplain. For example, in the Civil War, you just need to you're commissioned by the commander of the regiment. The law basically says you have to be a minister of the gospel. Even before World War I, you have a professionalization. You do need an ecclesiastical endorsement to get it. And this is, I think, really interesting in terms of the Catholic Church. One could not enlist into the chaplaincy without the endorsement of your bishop. Your bishop could order you to serve as a chaplain, but he also could prevent you. And you have these Catholic, priests who are begging the chief of chaplains, let me serve, I want to serve. And the chaplain says, I'm sorry, you're really going to have to follow church law here, though I love having your letter, because it shows that Catholic priests are not shirkers. They really do want to serve. And this is one of the, Chaplain Arnold, who's a Catholic Monsignor, he is often writing to bishops and their assistants saying, you've got to send more chaplains to our way. You've got to send more priests our way. The sacraments are being denied to GIs because you're not sending us enough chaplains. I could even go on more on ecclesiastical endorsement, but it's a fascinating issue to me in terms of the establishment religion and how it works and the tensions, but also the government it also will say to chaplains, if you lose your endorsement from your ecclesiastical body, we have to discharge you. You first and foremost are clergy above all.
I wanted to ask a question of my own, actually, because this occurred to me when you were talking about the Army's push for more Black chaplains to serve Black service members. And it put me in mind of the sort of trend in American Catholicism where Black parishes would be set up for Black Catholics. And it's this sort of double-edged sword where it can be a safer space for Black Catholics to congregate together. But another way, it's segregation. It's separating them from the rest, from white congregants. So did you get a sense while you were doing this research that the Army is doing this as a way of genuinely serving Black service members, or is it a separate but equal type situation?
It's I think a little of both. I mean, it's definitely, there's definitely a lot of institutional racism. So for example, the chief of chaplain is fabulous in terms of there is a senior Jewish chaplain serving with the chief of chaplains. There's a senior Protestant minister. The chief of chaplains is really integrated in terms of the tri-faith, though they're asked by one of the Protestant churches, why don't you appoint a senior Black chaplain in the leadership? And they refuse to do that. And I think the institutional racism is also expressed by only when a Chinese minister and a Protestant church says, we want to send this Chinese American minister your way, his service is rejected because we don't have enough Chinese troops for him to serve. When a Native American minister is put forth, they almost reject it. I think that they eventually accept him to serve. But the notion was, where you really see the racist thinking is only Black ministers can serve Black troops. Only Chinese American can serve Chinese troops. Now, when they don't have enough Black chaplains, white ministers can serve Black troops, but it doesn't go the other way around. We do not have a Black minister serving a white unit, even a Black Catholic priest. So there's a Black Catholic priest commissioned as a chaplain, and he is sent to an all Black unit, and he is serving 2% of the Catholics there. And this is the same time when the chiefly chaplain is writing about men who don't have access to the sacraments, who don't have access to Holy Communion, who don't have access to last rites, who don't have access, to the range of sacraments because there are not enough priests. So it is, I think, a double-edged sword. It is both, I think, the Army's effort to really promote Black religiosity and serve their needs, but it also has a strong element of institutional racism. But compared to the Army, Navy, the Army is wonderful. I mean, the importance of these Black chaplains cannot be overstated. The really good Black chaplains, like Chaplain Dokes, really take care of their men. In some units, they are the only officer. And they are really important in a lot of cases for trying to safeguard their men from the worst abuses of institutional racism.
I was really struck when you mentioned the chaplain's role as being these sorts of moral guardians to make sure that, service members stayed out of the brothels and they stayed away from drinking, et cetera, while also making provisions to kind of mitigate some of that activity. I was put in mind of the earliest days of chaplaincy to seafarers in ports, and this was one of the most important jobs. Right? These guys have been out at sea for a couple of weeks and they come back and there's folks they're loan sharking, they're gambling, there are women of the night. And so the chaplain's like, we got to get between the sailors and all of this because who knows what's going to happen if they get connected here. A lot of good questions here. Thank you all. Robert says, how did the Army deal with the great diversity among Protestants during World War II? You mentioned 3 dog tags. You get three options: PC or H. And H, by the way, for some who might be wondering, is Hebrew for Jewish service members. Was there an effort to meet the need for a variety of worship services, or was it sort of just, here's a Protestant?
This is really the biggest challenge, I think, for Protestant chaplaincy. While there's tension between, and it's pretty significant between, say, Orthodox, the chaplaincy for Jews is predominantly Reform, because a lot of Orthodox chaplains, rabbis can't meet the educational requirements. They don't have a seminary degree. But still, compared, there's still a lot of, there's still theologically, it's not that much of there's less to bridge. And Catholics, have their own chaplains, and it's very clear the military respects the uniqueness of Catholicism. But a Protestant chaplain, the Episcopal priest is to serve the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Southern Baptist, the Presbyterian, and the Episcopalian, and vice versa. A Christian Science minister is to cater to the needs of an Episcopalian. And that is really, it is fascinating how that works out, because, for example, Yost will say, I am giving you the Eucharist. I'm giving it as a Lutheran, I'm giving you the Lutheran Eucharist. This is how it works. You're free to take it or not take it. One Episcopal priest says, he was a little embarrassed because he did not have the capability to give communion, and his Protestant, his Catholic, they shared a foxhole. The Catholic chaplain, a fellow chaplain shared a foxhole, and this chaplain had plenty of reserve communion, and he was kind of shocked of how many Protestants, particularly even Southern Baptists, all of a sudden wanted communion from him, and he just wasn't prepared for it. He didn't dawn on him that, for example, evangelicals would want it. And I think both rabbis, but also Protestant ministers, really have to walk a delicate balance to try to serve all. And a lot of them do it very well. So, for example, Reform rabbis put a lot more, they do a lot more Hebrew in their services. They're often much more respectful of dietary laws. And a lot of ministers realize they're serving a really diverse swath of faiths within they're under the rubric of Protestant. And there are huge theological differences, say, between an Episcopalian and Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or a Christian Scientist.
David has an interesting question. You mentioned briefly liberation of some of the camps. Actually, I read a senior thesis very recently on the liberation of Dachau and Buchenwald that included the role of chaplains in some cases restraining GIs from sort of, eking out justice on the spot. But of course, in liberating camps, you have this big shift in the chaplains' kind of community, so to speak. Instead of just moving along with the units and ministering to soldiers, now you have all these prisoners. So tell us a little bit about when these camps were liberated. What was the chaplain's role with all of these people that now have to be, or not have to be, but deserve a great deal more service?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about liberation is we think of it as taking place only in the last weeks of the war, but it's occurring throughout the war. We're liberating Jews in hiding and Jewish communities being oppressed in, say, North Africa, under Vichy, Vichy territory that's liberated. There's still Jewish communities there. They're oppressed, but still present. So the process of liberation is sort of an ongoing one. One of the things you also see with chaplains of all the faiths, they're often trying to connect with particularly fellow ministers or fellow rabbis in different communities. And so, I mean, one of the things that a lot of Catholic priests really was so wonderful to them is that they got to celebrate Mass at the Vatican, or they got to go, both Catholic priests and lay got to, to have an audience with the Pope, or, Protestant ministers and priests getting to do pilgrimages to the Holy Land. So in terms of the process of liberation, I mean, what I think we need to know more is about what Catholic chaplains and Protestant ministers are doing, but Catholic chaplains are really key to sort of saving the remnant, saving Jews who would survive, particularly communicating what needs to be done to the Jewish Welfare Board and the need. I mean, one of the issues that becomes a problem for German Jews who are liberated is they're treated like Germans in terms of there's a non-fraternization order issue, and they're under this broad brush of you don't consort with the enemy. And the Jewish Welfare Board is these chaplains are writing the Jewish Welfare Board is we've got to make an exception to the non-fraternization rule, but they are using their supplies. They are getting supplies from the Jewish Welfare Board to help Jewish communities in Europe that are liberated and concentration camp survivors.
Mike asks a really interesting question that connects us pretty strongly to the present here. He says, moral injury is taking a prominent focus in the research today in military chaplaincy. Was there any mention of it in your research? And it probably fell under a different phrasing if I had to guess, but this sense of being a witness or even party to something horrendous and not being able to take the appropriate course of action. I'm sure the moral injury experts are saying, Michael, you're butchering the definition, but I think that's a summary of it.
Yeah, I think there are two things I did encounter the term moral injury at the time, and I wish I knew about the concept. I mean, I think one of the things I was sort of struck by was, and other chaplains, I mean, one chaplain expresses this openly. Um, there was relatively few expressions of concern over killing uh,
Mhm.
uh, during the war itself. And in fact, one chaplain says, you know, he was asked this in an interview in the 80s, and he says, you know, what about men who had moral reservation? He said, it's funny you should ask that. I had that a lot in Korea and particularly in Vietnam. It only happened once in World War II. He said aboard his naval ship, men got wind of the Halsey order, shoot all Japs, quote unquote Japs. I use that pejorative. Even if they're in the water, if their ship has been sunk, shoot them. And a lot of it, you know, some of the sailors came to him and said, we don't think this is right, that sailors, that if their ship has been sunk, they should be rescued. We shouldn't be shooting them in the water. And he approaches his captain and or the executive officer, and he expresses this concern that was raised by his men. Um, and he says, you know, he didn't get a really good reply, but fortunately, we never faced the situation. I was struck by how few sermons really dealt with killing, um, and there was a Protestant magazine created by mainline Protestants called The Link. There were more articles about, you know, there's more concern about all faiths, all of the tri-faith ministers and rabbis, about issues of morality, say, particularly premarital sexuality. You know, there's a handful of articles in The Link about killing. And in fact, one of the articles says, you know, the King James Version has it wrong. It's thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill, and goes into a whole discussion about translation of sacred scriptures. It's one of the reasons I don't think it's an issue is chaplains are the true, along with women, they're the true volunteers. If you have angst about this, you won't join. You don't have to join. Now, the reform movement did press their rabbis to serve, particularly almost order them. And Catholic bishops can order men to serve, but by and large, chaplains are true volunteers from the military perspective. And also, the Army had really good policies about conscientious objection, and that's something I discuss in my book. So I think those who might have had moral injury or had concerns about killing would have, you know, they're not in the military. I would also say, I mean, chaplains are really emphasizing this is the good fight, and it's necessary to do what we're doing, and I think a lot of GIs do. But I also do discuss moral breakdown, you know, mental breakdown, and the role of religion in that. And I think there are those people express this in post-war years. There are those who have moral injury from what they've done and what they've seen. I mean, I had one guy in an interview, he almost completely broke down in the interview. This is 50 years after service, because he committed war crimes and he routinely executed prisoners of war in cold blood, or he had men under his command do that. I remember interviewing a bomber pilot who 50 years afterwards had real issues by what he had done in the war. So it's definitely there, but it's surprisingly not very present during the war itself.
You know, a number of these questions kind of circle around who is the chaplain responsible for and to in their service? And this is another question in that vein. Did military chaplains attend to the spiritual needs of POWs? That's a really great question, Jonathan. Thank you.
Yes, they did, and that's what I would have loved to have explored that more. I mean, one of the things that you see a lot of references to when they captured Germans as prisoners of war, a lot of Catholic priests encounter Catholic priests who are in uniform as infantrymen or in other combat arms, because one of the things we do are very good about, we completely exempt the clergy from military service. Though there's, again, you're establishing a religion, so the military does not accept the claims of Jehovah's Witnesses that every member of that faith is a minister. They don't accept the claims of Nation of Islam, who claim ministerial exemption. But nonetheless, most ministers can and rabbis can get this blanket exemption, not in the German army. So you have Catholic priests and Protestant ministers serving, and a lot of them priests really reach out to these captured POWs, and chaplains do serve as ministers to POWs, particularly abroad. In the U.S., some chaplains are assigned to POW camps, but this is also something that civilian ministers perform, and civilian priests will perform for POWs. But the military does take care of the religious needs of POWs, and it's something that's an obligation under the Geneva Convention that prisoners of war have a right to freedom of religion.
At one point, you mentioned this ideal ratio of one chaplain for every 1,200 service members. And of course, that could never be reached. You'd have more saturation in some areas and less in others. Jerry has this question. Did lay leaders ever serve any functions of a chaplain if a chaplain was not available?
Yeah, I mean, it particularly happens a lot on ships. Small ships don't have chaplains, and a lot of ships, and it's clear there are religions happening on this ship. I know on one African, on the USS Mason, which had an all-black crew except for a few white officers, there was a Bible study going on, and we know that there are lay leadership does occur on ships, particularly, or in men are cut off and someone takes the lead. It's interesting in terms of the Jewish tradition. You don't really need a rabbi to have services. I mean, rabbis are, what's crucial is a minyan, and then in that era, enough male Jews to say the, certain prayer. And I remember this one Reformed rabbi, he says to these guys on this one base, he says, I am ruling that if you have two Jews together, you can hold services. That's my ruling on what a minyan. And then this one Jew says to him, I'm not very comfortable with Hebrew. I forgot most of my bar mitzvah Hebrew. And he goes, God understands English. So pray in English if you can't do the Hebrew. So there's definitely and I also remember this story that didn't make the book, the importance of saying Kaddish. So the prayer, the morning prayer, the prayer you say in morning. And I remember one guy was at a bar and he said, he's tapped on the shoulder and he said, could you participate, in the prayer, the prayer, the morning, the prayer for morning, and he's, he steps out, they say the prayer, and then he goes back to drinking. And I remember one really moving case where this one, guy learns that his father's been killed. A Protestant minister says this news to him. Where's the rabbi? The rabbi there's no rabbi for him. But he says for the next 8 days, he and his fellow Jewish comrades said the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, every day. They stood up, even though they were on the battle line, to say the prayer. And that was very meaningful to Roland Winter. And it struck out 50 years after the war.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your research. This is fantastic. And I personally, as a fellow historian, am so happy to see this much engagement, excitement. This is clearly something that folks are very interested in. So thank you very much for being with us, folks. The link to the book is on the website. It'll be in the follow-up email. Go order it. I know for sure 1 or 2 books have been ordered during this webinar. So I
just want to add, I really want to thank chaplains, particularly military chaplains, who continue to serve, those in uniform and those to serve in all kinds of capacities. I really have a lot of admiration for good chaplains.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to being with you again, hopefully on camera next time. But until then, have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.